So let's talk about the progressive movement. We're going to try to understand how this progressive movement comes about. This is different than the populist movement. The populists were Midwestern farmers trying to promote inflation. The progressives are a different movement. And what makes them different is that the progressives feel that the government can be used to do good things. And they're going to try to regulate the abuses of capitalism and try to protect citizens. Some of the early movements towards progressivism and this idea of making the country better through federal power springs from urban problems, like the tenements, which were rundown, dangerous areas where a lot of those new immigrants were living. One of the things that the progressives were upset about was that they said that the political machines were corrupt. Because a lot of the progressive leaders were also in that middle-class white group, they also don't want the immigrants to be voting, especially if they're voting in a way that is going to promote the power of the urban area and the machines, which they said were pretty corrupt. Progressives also are going to fight monopolies. They're going to, again, try to regulate the abuses of capitalism. So we're going to see how the progressives try to do that. And they're going to try to protect workers and consumers. They're also concerned with race issues. So we're going to see some of the early civil rights leaders would be considered progressives because they're going to try to get the government to protect the people that are harmed by racist policies. And we're going to see there's some populism involved here, which means kind of from the ground up, the people are going to try to use the government to change policies, mostly trying to overcome the abuses of the wealthy and the corporate interests. One of the biggest groups promoting progressivism are the Muckrakers. Muckrakers, journalists that are going to be uncovering the filth of society. And they're going to expose all of these problems, this corruption in American society. And they're going to try to get government to see the problem so that the government will fix it. So the journalists aren't really offering any solutions. They're just trying to expose the problem so that other people fix it. This is a picture of a tenement. The picture was taken by a guy named Jacob Rees, and he is showing a New York immigrant in this picture in his book, How the Other Half Lives. So again, kind of dirty, rundown, problematic area that Rees is going to try to fight. We've seen this cartoon before. This is Rockefeller right here, and you can see he's trimming his Standard Oil rose. Ida Tarbell and others are going to expose the problems of monopolies. Tarbell is going to be exposing Standard Oil Company and its corrupt practices. Remember, Rockefeller was using horizontal integration to eliminate his competition and create a single unified company. And you can see that by the fact that in this cartoon, he has trimmed off the various competitors down here at the bottom. You can see that right here, competitors, to give himself this big bloom. Rockefeller said this is social Darwinism in practice, that the best company is rising to the top of being most successful. But what Tarbell and those muckrakers are going to say is that he's, one, using corrupt business practices, things like kickbacks and others. He's going to use corporate espionage, but he's also using the power that he has from being a wealthy corporation to influence politicians. And by influencing those politicians, he gets legislation that makes it harder for his competitors to stay in business. This is bad for workers because they're going to get paid less and they have to work for longer hours in worse conditions. And it's bad for consumers because they get a product that's not quite as good at a much more expensive price. So while he says it's social Darwinism, it's really not. Now, this is a very important person right here. This is Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's going to be president in 1900, and he is going to oversee a domestic progressive resurgence at the national level. One of the things that he kind of stumbles into is the Food and Drug Administration. A muckraker named Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. Now, Upton Sinclair was a socialist, and he was trying to expose all the problems that workers faced in the meatpacking industry. He wanted the workers to have better hours, conditions, and pay. But as a socialist, he went into these meatpacking industries, and he writes this big expose trying to show the plight of the workers, but people read it and realize all the terrible things that are happening to their meat. Rotten meat thrown into the sausage, rat droppings everywhere, fingernails falling off the workers and into the sausage piles. Upton Sinclair exposed the problem, and now it's laid at Teddy Roosevelt's feet, and he needs to do something about it. So he uses the power of the federal government, because he's a progressive, in order to create the Food and Drug Administration. The federal government begins passing laws to make things better. That's the ideal of a progressive. You can see here he's muckraking, right? There's the meat scandal, and he's muckraking it, and he's the president, so he has to deal with it. A lot of these muckrakers and progressives see social responsibility. They want to help take care of the people around them and have a positive community. An example of this is Jane Addams, who starts the settlement house movement. Also, her specific form of the settlement house movement is the Hull House. At the Hull House, she bought this house in the middle of Chicago in an immigrant area, and she opened up the house to immigrants that that needed help, right? So she's helping immigrants. She's trying to combat the tenement slums. Again, middle class, college-educated women that had little outlet for their other work. They can't get jobs. They're not really going to be taken seriously in the business world. And the Hull House and the settlement house movement is going to take care of the immigrants' practical needs. It's going to be daycare for immigrants that need to go work. They're going to learn eventually how to speak English. The kids are going to acclimate. They're going to learn how to play games in an American style, those types of things. Progressives are also very concerned with social justice, meaning that they want to create better working conditions and better living conditions for people that are being oppressed. This includes trying to eliminate child labor and trying to promote education. Again, they're trying to correct the economic and social abuses of a capitalist industrial society, and they're trying to use the government to achieve those ends. An example of this is the temperance movement. To temperance means to slow down. So the temperance movement is a campaign against drinking alcohol. And you can see that in the picture down here. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So these are women temperance movement, probably from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, trying to promote men to stop drinking alcohol. In some Christian communities, they're going to see that as a sin, that drinking to drunkenness is a sin. Some temperance advocates are going to say that it's going to help reduce domestic violence because men won't get drunk and they come home and beat their wives. That it will reduce crime because people will stop spending all their money on alcohol and they'll save and move up in society. And they can promote progress, that people will get better and they will do better things because they're not drinking as much. Some reformers actually criticized the temperance movement because they overlooked other causes of poverty. For example, the Women's Christian Temperance Union blamed Southern Black community poverty on drinking too much alcohol. People like Ida B. Wells are going to tell the Women's Christian Temperance Union that they should also be looking at things like racist oppression of the Jim Crow laws that prevent African Americans and African American men at that point from being able to get jobs and from being able to buy homes and other things like that. Here's some of the labor legislation. In this era, we can see the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire occurs. In this Triangle Shirtwaist factory, which is actually these floors up here, women were held in essentially would be a sweat factory, right? A sweatshop. The owner of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory was upset because women were leaving during the day to take a break. So he locked the door from the outside. He's surrounded by a bunch of cloth in dangerous conditions there, and they're locked in. The shirtwaist factory, which just means shirts, the shirtwaist factory caught fire. The women couldn't escape. Many of them jumped out of the factory window. Here's their dead bodies. And 146 women died either through fire or falling to their deaths. Because these women died, many laws finally started to change. The government steps in and tries to start passing some labor condition laws, better hours, wages, conditions to go along with the union work, the work that the unions were trying to do. The Supreme Court does step in on this, though. The Supreme Court argues that people have a right to work, and we live in a right to work state. And all that means is that you should not be denied the ability to sell your labor to whoever you want for whatever price they're willing to pay, regardless of whether or not there's a union. So in some states, for example, when I taught up in New York, I was required to join the union. And I paid dues to the union, and the union would work to give me better hours and better pay, and it would fight on my behalf for various things. But in South Carolina, we're not allowed to have that. The union cannot be required by a school because we have a right to work in South Carolina. It's really just an anti-union law. So the Supreme Court also is going to overturn early child labor laws. Again, based on the idea of a right to work, children should be able to sell their labor for whatever they want for whoever will be willing to pay for it. There are some unfortunate progressive movements, and probably the worst among them is the Carlisle Indian schools. This is forced assimilation of Native American children. You can see all these Native American children here. They were stolen away from their families in the West and taken to boarding schools out in the East, where they are taught to work and talk and dress and eat in a white fashion. Again, remember, going all the way back to the Dawes Act, this is kill the Indian, save the man. They're trying to ruin the culture, trying to get rid of the culture and force assimilation. The progressives do pass several amendments during this time. Remember, we had the Reconstruction amendments in the Reconstruction era. The progressive era is going to have progressive amendments. The first is the 16th Amendment, which is a progressive income tax. The farmers are actually going to fight for this progressive income tax. The argument being that farmers have a lot of land, so they had a lot of property tax, but they didn't have a lot of income. The farmers want to have an income tax because the wealthy had a lot of money, but didn't have a whole lot of property. So they were getting away with keeping a lot of money that the farmers said they should be paying more. So the common person actually wanted the progressive income tax this time so that the rich would pay their fair share because they benefited most from society. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators because what they're trying to prevent is this right here. The state used to each state would Each state would appoint their senators. So the fear was that the wealthy were simply paying money to the state legislator to get either themselves or their chosen candidate put into the Senate. The people wanted to have a check on the power of the wealthy so that they couldn't rig the elections to benefit themselves. The 18th Amendment is a prohibition of alcohol. Remember those temperance people. Now it's going to start during the Reconstruction in 1920, during the Progressive era. It's going to end by 1932 in the Great Depression with the 21st Amendment. And the last one is the 19th Amendment following World War I in 1920, where women are going to get the right to vote. These are progressive amendments where the government is trying to help improve citizens' lives. Let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt. This is one of my favorite cartoons. Here's Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive president, known as the trust buster. He's going to break up the trusts, which is the monopolies. But he doesn't really do that. Teddy Roosevelt's known as a hunter. So you can see he's hunting here. And he's killing the bad trusts, right? He's making sure the bad trusts don't exist. But if you look over there on the other side, he's keeping the good trusts on a leash. He's restraining them. He says some monopolies are okay as long as they treat the workers well and treat the consumers fairly. And then for some creepy reason, he's making the other corporations carry the dead bodies of the bad trusts. Anyways, he had what he called the square deal. Square, meaning fair on all sides. He's going to protect the workers by making the owners give them a fair deal. He's not going to benefit one side or the other, but he's no longer going to use the government to protect the owners. In fact, in the 1902 coal strike, he uses the federal military in order to go in and threaten the owners that if they didn't give a fair deal to the workers, he would use the military to mine the coal, not to strike at the workers, but to mine the coal and take the ownership of the factory, the mine away from them. We say that he used the bully pulpit, so he was very good at giving speeches that would set the agenda for controlling corporations. He loved being out there and talking. Let's see. Why is he trust busting? Because trusts or monopolies, they want to limit competition. By limiting competition, that means the prices are going to go higher, and it also means that the consumer is going to get less of a good deal. It also means workers are going to suffer. So Teddy Roosevelt breaks up the trusts in order to promote competition, and by promoting competition, that's going to lower prices, improve the quality, and the workers get better conditions. They're going to do this in a couple of ways. The first and most important here is the Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman is the guy that proposed it. Anti means against, trust, monopolies. So it's against monopolies. They're also going to use the Interstate Commerce Act to try to eliminate unfair business practices. In other words, promote competition. They're going to break up and control monopolies, and that's going to lead to better wages, better conditions, better and cheaper products for consumers. Roosevelt's also a conservationist, meaning he wants to protect the environment. So you can see here, these are different national parks that Teddy Roosevelt helped to get started. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different national parks are going to be created, probably more, hundreds of thousands of acres set aside in order to protect conservation. He creates the FDA after Sinclair's jungles related. He's going to create the majority of the national parks we still have today in order to conserve America's wilderness and natural resources. And he's going to beef up the Interstate Commission and Sherman Antitrust Act. One of the things he didn't do a very good job with was race relations. He invited Booker T. Washington to come and have dinner with him at the White House, and the Southern outcry by those white supremacists there was so severe, and Teddy Roosevelt wanted to get reelected again. It's part of the problem with politicians, is that even though he knew it was the right thing to do to support these racial progressive issues, he doesn't do anything the rest of his tenure to help the racial issues in the South. We're also going to see that he's an open imperialist in the next unit. So he is also completely bought into the white man's burden idea of colonialism, that the United States as a rich white nation had an obligation to go into non-white countries to help civilize them. In 1908, Teddy Roosevelt has served 2 terms. He decides that he's going to retire. He's going to go hunt some big game out in Africa, and he endorses William Howard Taft, this guy right here, to be his chosen successor. And Roosevelt was so popular, Taft easily wins. He again gets the win against that progressive William Jennings Bryan, but as this cartoon is showing us, William Taft is going to go against some of the policies that Roosevelt wanted. He lowers the tariff. Roosevelt wanted a high tariff to protect the workers. Taft wants a low tariff because he wants to start getting more global trade. Taft is more aggressive at breaking up the trusts. Roosevelt thought that good trusts should be left alone if they're being fair. Taft says, nope, break them all up. That leads to a big Roosevelt-Taft feud, and in 1912, Roosevelt comes back from Africa and runs for election again. But Taft is still going to be the Republican candidate, so Teddy Roosevelt forms a new political party called the Progressive Party, also called the Bull Moose Party, because when somebody asked Roosevelt how he felt, he said, "I feel as healthy as a bull moose." So they called it the Bull Moose Party. They ran a conservative, the Republicans ran a conservative Taft. The progressives run Roosevelt, who's going to draw a lot of Republican votes away. And the Democrats are going to run somebody called Woodrow Wilson. And what we can see in this cartoon is when you take the Republicans and you divide out all of the Republicans that would have voted for Teddy Roosevelt, well, Woodrow Wilson wins the election, even though he doesn't have a majority of the vote. Now, he's going to be progressive. That's great, but he's way more racist than Roosevelt was. He's going to lower the tariff even further than Taft did. He's going to increase the federal income tax to a whopping 1% on anybody that made over $3,000, which in 2021 money would have been about $85,000. Everybody below that didn't pay anything. He is going to create the Federal Reserve. which was kind of a bank for banks that helps to control money supply, keep the currency stable. In other words, it's doing that thing that the farmers wanted with bimetallism. So he's got kind of that progressive populist mindedness. He's going to be antitrust. He enhances the Sherman Antitrust Act by creating the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was passed in order to protect unions. He also is going to create the Federal Trade Commission in order to regulate trusts even further. So he does some good things, but whoa, does he do some bad stuff. This is a movie poster called The Birth of a Nation, and it shows the Ku Klux Klan as the heroes of Reconstruction, riding in to save the honor and dignity of the white Southerners. You see, Woodrow Wilson's progressivism was for whites only. In fact, Roosevelt had started to slowly desegregate the federal government. Wilson whipped segregation back into the federal government, openly supports racial discrimination, supports Jim Crow laws, saying that it was for the good of both black and white people in the South. He watches this movie, this one, Birth of a Nation, in the White House, and says it was like writing history with lightning. Not good. The progressive era also sees the rise of the women's suffrage movement. Western states began the process of suffrage, or giving women the right to vote. You can see over here, it is the Western states that give women the right to vote first. Or if you want to look at this cartoon, this is Lady Liberty bringing votes for women to the oppressed women of the East. Now, Wilson doesn't have a very good record on this either. In order to get the vote for women, some women, like at NASA, were trying to get state-by-state elections. Alice Paul is going to fight for a federal amendment which would give the same rights for all women across the country for that vote for suffrage. Alice Paul is going to have protests like this one here, where she's going to be arrested, put in jail, goes on a hunger strike, is force-fed through a nose in her tube in her nose, horrible stuff, and is eventually going to be released. Wilson only relents and eventually supports the women's 19th Amendment after World War I, after women proved to be valuable allies during that time period. Like I said, there are limits to progressivism. It's going to coincide with a wave of nativism. Remember, we said that the progressives didn't like the political machines because the immigrants were getting more power and more say. Progressivism is tied in with nativism here. So it's very anti-immigrant. It's kind of white supremacy adjacent here. You can see here that some people criticize nativists because while these are supposed to be sort of the nativists in this cartoon, stopping the new immigrant from coming, if you look at their shadows, they're only a couple of generations away from being immigrants themselves. So largely a middle-class movement, but it's very influential nevertheless.